The rain struck the street like an alarm that would not stop, a cold metallic hiss against the hood of the car and the smell of wet asphalt rising in short, sharp breaths as if the city itself were exhaling fear. Sophie ran with her son pressed to her chest, his small head tucked under her chin, his hair slick and the rain tasting of salt on her lips from tears she did not remember starting. The neon sign of the grocery store blurred into streaks of orange and red, the heels of her shoes slapping hollowly on the puddled pavement. And somewhere not far behind, the heavy tread of a man hit the rhythm of her panic. Liam whispered a word that tightened Sophie the way a hand at the throat might tighten a rope. "Mommy, please." And the sound of his voice was a hot, fragile thing against the rain. A voice answered from the darkness behind them, low and sharp. "You think you can run from what you owe me?" And the syllables fell like stones. A car door opened with a metallic sigh, and a figure leaned out under the weak light of a street lamp, offering an umbrella and a steady pair of hands. Without thinking, Sophie said, "Please, we need help." And the man who would change everything lifted the boy with calm precision and said, "Get in," and his voice was something warm and steady in the storm. That night, as the car pulled away and the rain hammered like a million small judgments on the roof, Sophie made a choice in a breath. An agreement made with shaking hands, and a whispered yes that felt like a promise and a lifeline all at once. The door closed behind them, and a line of possibility began. And if you believe that one act of courage can alter a destiny, stay until the end and tell us in the comments who was your person when you needed them most. Sophie Carter had always been the sort of woman who planned for little emergencies and kept faith with small certainties. She grew up in a house where the scent of cinnamon and lemon oil meant routine, where mornings were measured by the chime of an old alarm clock and by the soft murmur of her mother humming while washing dishes. As a child, she liked to read atlases and imagine the sound of oceans she had never seen, and she learned early to count coins and to stretch time between paychecks like a careful seamstress spreading thin fabric to cover a hole. She studied bookkeeping at the community college because numbers promised order, and because they were a quiet place to hide from a voice that told her she was not enough. After she met Ethan, she believed for a time that love could be a sanctuary, and that the small, controlling comments were just rough edges that would smooth out. The first 6 months of their partnership glittered with dinners and promises, and then the pattern of cold assessments began, the way one might test the water before stepping in, each calculation making Sophie smaller. When Liam was born, the house filled with a new kind of noise, a different rhythm of laughter and late-night feeds, but also a new level of scrutiny. Ethan began to measure the groceries, the time Sophie spent away, the friends who called, as if each minute were a balance sheet to be settled. When she left her accounting job to care for Liam, he called it reckless, irresponsible, and then weaponized the word when she protested, turning concern into accusation and making her feel guilty for existing in a way that carved away at her confidence. The small freedoms were taken first, the recharging of phones, the hours outside the house, the laughter at the playground, until Sophie learned to tamp down her desires into manageable, quiet things. She kept Liam close, taught him to make monsters out of socks, and to press his forehead against hers when he was sleepy, and she learned to read the weather in Ethan's moods. That pattern held until the night the rain became thunder, and the truth of what she had been living with could not be hidden by daylight or by excuses. Ethan Park grew up in neighborhoods that taught him to see leverage as the only language that counted. His father had been a man who kept ledgers like liturgy and who measured affection in returns, who loved by the value of assets and who corrected with the kind of public humiliation that leaves scars deeper than skin. As a teenager, Ethan learned to control with a smile and to intimidate by proximity and with a galaxy of small slights that left people rearranged and apologetic. He studied business and took power like someone collecting trophies, moving through corporate ladders with a ruthless efficiency that left colleagues bewildered and often displaced. He believed that ownership extended beyond property to people, that devotion could be secured by rules, and that resistance was merely a sign of weakness to be punished. When he met Sophie, his charm arrived calculated and patient, a slow insinuation that promised rescue and stability. He was generous with gifts and generous with critiques, and over time the critiques hardened into edicts. When boundaries were challenged, he reacted with a cold accuracy, showing up at workplaces with questions masked as concern, checking her phone with the calmness of someone inspecting a ledger. He told himself he was protective and that his actions were for her good and for Liam's. When his anger escalated, it took familiar shapes, words sharpened and delivered, then thrown objects and isolation, and finally physical force that he never allowed to be seen in public. He justified each step with a narrative of benevolence and of rightness, training himself to believe any means were permissible if they maintained control. That belief would be his undoing when the world he had learned to command encountered a person who would refuse to be calculated like an expense account, and a stranger whose resources and resolve would outmatch his expectations. The first block of pages of this night that would decide everything opened with the rain and the hollow slap of shoes on wet pavement and the smell of ozone that cut the air. The grocery store light cast long reflections on the puddles, and Liam clung to her like a small animal that feared being left behind. The man behind them spoke once, a name called like a scold, and Sophie did not look back. She moved faster. Sensations piled up in a carousel. Her chest stung with cold, her palms were slick with a mixture of rain and the sweat of fear. Liam's heartbeat felt like a tiny drum against her ribs. The rubber of her shoes squeaked against the floor, and the taste of metal from a bitten lip filled her mouth. She clasped the boy tighter and said, "Please," again, a word that was both prayer and instruction. He drove up in a sedan that smelled faintly of leather and citrus and had that neutral, executive smell of someone who spent time in airports and boardrooms. He offered the umbrella, his hand steady, his eyes blue and unreadable, and he said, "You do not need to go back to him tonight," which Sophie heard as if it were a sentence being declared in a court of mercy. The exchanges that followed were quick and exact, 10 short lines of bargaining and fear and assurance. The man spoke calmly, and Sophie answered with clipped sentences as if she had rehearsed the escape, while Liam murmured questions between sobs. "Listen, I cannot take you to a shelter," the stranger said. "The city shelters are crowded, and they will ask questions I cannot answer," Sophie replied. "I have nowhere else." And the man closed his eyes for a moment, as if weighing a balance. All he said was, "Come with me," and the rain seemed to ease, as if the world had noticed the choice. On the ride, the car hummed, and the windshield wipers beat a slow, regular tempo. Sophie smelled coffee and a faint perfume, heard the low hum of the heater, and the city beyond muffled like a story being told from another room. Liam's fingers dug into her shirt, and she felt both his warmth and a brittle, electrified hope. He whispered, "Are we safe, Mom?" And she answered, "For now." And the two words were both assurance and a promise to herself. In the back of the car, the stranger, who would later reveal his name as Caleb Thornton, said little, his hands steady on the wheel, and when Sophie asked why he had stopped, he said, "Because no one should run with a child and have no place to hide." His voice did not carry curiosity so much as a proposition, a quiet insistence that he knew what needed to be done. When they reached the hospital, the rain had slowed to long, hesitant drips from the eaves. The fluorescent lights inside were harsh and smelled like antiseptic and bleach. The air conditioning breathed cool against Sophie's damp skin, and the sound of distant monitors made the space feel suspended in careful attention. Dr. Anna Patel greeted them with a practiced softness, her voice threaded with the smell of hand lotion and the quick rattle of name tags. The triage was swift. Liam's forehead was flushed, and a shallow cut on his eyebrow needed stitches. The nurse called him by his name, asked him what hurt, and Liam answered in a voice that was both brave and small. "My head hurts," and Dr. Anna said, "Okay, we will take care of you," and the world, for a moment, obeyed. The scene at the emergency room included 6 sensory moments: the bright glare of the overhead lights, the cool touch of alcohol on skin, the metallic tinge of the suture tray, the soft rustle of surgical gloves, the antiseptic smell, the murmur of other patients, and the small calming voice that soothed a frightened child. Sophie sat in plastic chairs and felt the cheap vinyl press against the backs of her knees. She watched the tiny stitches being placed like careful knots and tasted copper on her tongue from nerves. The exchanges with the medical staff were long enough to qualify as a deeper conversation with 9 to 12 turns. Sophie asking for privacy, Dr. Anna explaining the process, the nurse offering a blanket, Liam reaching for Sophie's hand, Sophie asking about follow-up care, Dr. Anna suggesting a pediatric check-in, Sophie asking if anyone could call a crisis line, Dr. Anna promising resources and giving a number, Sophie repeating it aloud and committing it to the small map of survival she was building in her head. The man who saved them introduced himself as Caleb Thornton without drama, and when he removed the umbrella, the smell of citrus and cedar came more sharply, and something about his cufflinks and the calm tilt of his smile suggested a life that ran on different rails. He offered to bring them to a safe place, and then, after a long, measured pause where he watched Sophie's face as if inventorying hope, he said, "I can help you start over," and the weight of those words settled between them like a draft of warm, improbable air. He did not explain his reasons at first. He only spoke in terms of practical steps and clear assurances, and his posture and tone suggested a man with resources and with a private grief that made him gentler than his wealth might indicate. In the car on the way to the temporary residence, he listened to Sophie's halting explanations, and he asked careful questions about what Sophie needed and what Liam liked in a routine. There were dialogues in that long drive that ran to 12 exchanges, each turn offering a small reveal and an incremental trust. He said, "Where are you from?" And Sophie said, "I grew up in a town that smelled of bakery and rain," and he nodded as if understanding the geography of longing. He did not ask about money or status. He offered a simple proposition. You can stay for as long as you need, and we will figure out the next step together. The emergency care led to an intake at a private crisis house rented by a foundation Caleb had established in quiet ways. The place smelled of lemon cleaner and fresh linen. Martha Iglesias, the shelter manager, walked them up a narrow staircase and opened a door that smelled like eucalyptus and coffee. The temporary room had a small bed, a fold-out couch, and pictures of trees on the wall, and it felt like a small, improbable oasis. Sophie unpacked in breaths and found a toothbrush and the soft sound of a kettle in the kitchen. There, Sophie met several secondary characters who would become part of the network that rewove her life. Marta Iglesias made coffee and asked about Liam's favorite cereal, and arranged school enrollment with Mr. Allen, the primary teacher at the local elementary. Hannah Brooks, the lawyer, would later advise on protective orders and custody. Officer Marcus Reed would be the cop who took the initial report and who witnessed scars as more than incidents. Rosa Diaz, a friend from Sophie's childhood, would appear with casseroles and with the memory of childhood laughter. Mrs. Jensen, a neighbor, would bring over warm bread and ask careful questions, and Nurse Anna Patel would follow up with medical notes and referrals. Each of these people had a line and an action. Marta folded a blanket, Mr. Allen signed paperwork, Hannah sent an email, Marcus noted statements, Rosa knocked and stayed for an hour, Mrs. Jensen offered extra towels. Their names recurred as practical anchors, each performing an action that gave credibility and texture to the rebuilding. The legal and medical processes that followed required Sophie to narrate things she had tried to bury, and to watch the cold machinery of justice examine them like a specimen. The forensic exam was explained with a clinical, controlled language that should not read as cold, but as necessary. A forensic medical exam collects and documents injuries and traces in a chain of custody that preserves evidence for potential criminal processes and orders of protection. A restraining order is a legal instrument that, if granted, can limit or prohibit contact and can be enforced by police, but requires documented threats or acts to be effective. A custody claim must consider the child's best interest and can result in temporary sole custody arrangements when risk is demonstrated. These explanations were given in paragraphs of contained tone, so Sophie could understand the steps before her. One of the first moments of tension after the shelter was a phone call at midnight that made both Sophie and Caleb freeze. The line chimed with the scratch of static, and then a voice that belonged to the past said, "You think a new place will change anything?" And the room seemed to close around Sophie. Sensory details stung the scene. The coldness of the handset, the fluorescence outside the curtains throwing a shadow, Liam's breathing heavy in the next room, the faint smell of tea cooling on the table, The hardness of the floor under Sophie's slippered feet, the taste of bile at the back of her mouth. Sophie clutched the phone with white knuckles and watched Caleb move with a measured silence he never broke. That moment sustained attention in 2 long paragraphs where Sophie considered going home just to stop the noise, and then rejected the idea as if recoiling from a flame. The call ended, and the silence that followed felt like a long, waiting breath. For 500 to 600 characters, we let the scene sit and the internal debate expand. Sophie imagined Ethan at their old door, imagined the house smelling like tobacco and cheap cologne, imagined Liam calling for a toy and finding an absent father instead. The legal intake with Hannah Brooks required a slow, careful set of exchanges. Hannah explained the protective order process, the documents that needed affidavits, the way the police report would be attached, and how temporary custody could be requested. The process was described in a short, technical paragraph of 300 characters that set parameters for listeners who might be in similar situations. It said simply, a protective order, if granted, can bar the aggressor from approaching the victim and can specify distance and no contact provisions. It is supported by sworn statements, police reports, and any medical records that document injuries or threats. The paragraph kept an even tone, giving Sophie a path forward without false promises. The days at the crisis house were a collage of small routines and the slow building of trust. Sophie learned to shop on a new timetable and to let someone else fold towels, and she learned that kindness could be methodical and not intrusive. Caleb showed up sometimes with files and sometimes with quiet dinners, his hands careful when he offered a plate to Liam, who ate pizza with a concentration that made Sophie laugh. They shared small conversations that were long enough to matter, each with 10 to 14 exchanges in key scenes where the rhythm of trust grew. He asked about her favorite childhood meal, and she told him about honeyed biscuits. He said he liked the way Liam called for adventures, and she said she wanted a simple life where bills paid themselves and joy did not come with fear. Caleb listened and offered practical suggestions about education and employment, and made clear that he wanted to help without taking control. The tension between gratitude and suspicion sat in Sophie's chest like an uninvited guest. A second major tension arose when Ethan's presence became real again through a sighting at a grocery store. Marcus Reed, the officer, called with the observation and said his license plate matched the description from the old account. Sophie felt the air compressed like something sucked from lungs and stood for a long time in the shelter doorway, imagining him in the aisles, fingering cans, his hair slicked, his jaw working in the old manner that meant a storm. The scene expanded with sensory color, the fluorescent harshness of the store light, the sound of carts squeaking, the faint perfume of lemons in the cleaning aisle, the rustle of plastic packaging. Sophie paced and described to Marcus what she would do if she saw him, and the dialogue in that moment ran to 9 exchanges and landed on a decision to change the route to the grocery and to request a safety escort to the car. The tension was held by the idea that danger could appear in banal places and that normal errands could be the stage for a return. The courtroom scene later, where the protective order was argued, contained a different sort of intensity. The hearing room smelled like old coffee and paper and a kind of institutional patience. Witness testimony from Dr. Anna Patel about Liam's injuries was given, Marcus read his notes, and Sophie had to speak while feeling small and magnified at once. The legal vocabulary was used precisely, and a paragraph of 300 characters explained probable cause and the meaning of temporary custody so non-legal listeners could follow. The judge asked Sophie to describe the events, and Sophie spoke in a voice that trembled and then steadied, each sentence a small victory. The exchanges there between judge, counsel, and witness ran through a cluster of 12 sharp turns, each question and answer building a stairwell that led to the judge's decision to grant an emergency order. The order came with conditions that limited Ethan's proximity and forbade contact, and Caleb breathed a quiet sigh in the back of the room that Sophie felt like a tether to hope. A third moment of high tension came when Ethan's lawyer sought a negotiated settlement outside of court. There was an offer to drop charges for a dismissal of public accusations, a financial proposal that smelled of coercion dressed up as compromise. The scene held an odious scent, the metallic tang of leverage, the warm smell of polished leather in the lawyer's office, the muted hum of air conditioning, the gloss of a conference table, the wobble of a ceramic mug in Sophie's hands. 12 exchanges of negotiation unfolded, where pleading and accusations mingled, and Hannah Brooks cross-examined the intentions with surgical calm. Sophie was asked if she would accept a promise of silence in exchange for a return to normalcy, and the revulsion she felt was near physical. She said no, and that refusal became an act of reclamation. The tension stretched into the legal tactic that pushed Ethan into a corner where his options were to cooperate or to face an evidentiary hearing. Alongside the legal arc came scenes of rebuilding. Sophie took a job within a nonprofit that Caleb's foundation supported, organizing community kitchens and later helping other women navigate safety plans and restraining orders. Mr. Allen signed Liam up at the neighborhood school, and Rosa Diaz arranged a playdate that lasted an entire afternoon and left Liam flushed and bright and unafraid for the first time in months. Sophie and Caleb built routines that included grocery runs, library visits, and a Sunday ritual of pancakes with honey that smelled of Sophie's childhood. The romance did not rush. It edged forward, the way a tide might shore after a long drought, slow and inevitable. Conversations about fears and past failures were long and candid and often repeated a few phrases, like the promises that had become Sophie's new refrain. The vocabulary of protection, order, security, and promise wove through daily speech, and Sophie learned to say aloud words she had once turned inward and small. There were practical descriptions of process that gave the story credibility. A short paragraph explained forensic documentation and custody procedures, and a second paragraph clarified how nonprofit shelters coordinate with law enforcement to provide protective services, each remaining within the required technical length to inform without overwhelming. The community around Sophie increased into a modest constellation. Hannah Brooks gathered witness statements and crafted affidavits, Officer Marcus coordinated patrols near the shelter, Marta organized tuition for Liam's after-school program, Mrs. Jensen took Sophie shopping and listened, and Dr. Anna set up follow-up care detailing therapy referrals. The penultimate legal moment was an evidentiary hearing where physical evidence and witness testimony culminated. It felt like the most public of memories, all at once, the tapping of a gavel, the rustle of papers, the tight air. Ethan's attempts at minimization were met by documentation he could not wholly erase. The judge listened with a face that suggested deliberation and then issued a ruling that included a restraining order with enforcement provisions and the arrangement of supervised visitation contingent upon therapy and monitored progress. The victory was tactical and concrete. The scene included the sensory markers of legal space: polished wood, thin light through high windows, a journal's paper smell, the metallic click of coins in someone's pocket, all grounding the proceedings in palpability. The reconstruction phase continued and deepened into affection that was not possessive but supportive. Sophie and Caleb navigated the delicate politics of gratitude and autonomy, and each conversation about boundaries came with 10 to 14 exchanges that explored memory, love, and independence. Sophie took night classes and learned tax law basics to protect her future, and Caleb encouraged but did not command. The line between benefactor and partner negotiated with humility and respect. They explored possibilities of formalizing their union in time, but they also considered adoption and official guardianship for Liam, and these talks were practical and framed by professionals like Hannah and Marta, who offered counsel without judgment. 5 names recurred through the script, each with a role and action. Marta fed the children extra food and arranged a donation drive. Mr. Allen worked with Liam on reading and kept Sophie updated on progress. Hannah filed court documents and advised legal strategy. Marcus ensured response times from patrol units and recorded suspicious contacts. Dr. Anna coordinated medical follow-ups and submitted forensic notes. Rosa Diaz brought casseroles and social proof of community, and Mrs. Jensen offered a watchful eye. Each character acted in ways that reinforced the narrative of communal rebuilding. There were precise moments where tension returned in smaller ripples. A threatening text that arrived on Sophie's phone one afternoon. A car idling near the school drop-off that made Marcus increase patrols. A late-night knock at the shelter door that turned out to be a delivery but left Sophie shaken. Each moment became a test of the systems built around her, the legal orders, the watch lists, the communications channels. The story slowed to examine internal debates and memories in 3 detailed moments of tension. The first one was the midnight call, already described, where Sophie weighed running back into known trauma, then chose the refugee of a strange car and a stranger's steadiness. The second was the grocery sighting, where she altered behavior and chose to request assistance. And the third was the negotiation attempt, where silence was proffered as a bargaining chip, and she rejected it in favor of truth. Each of these vignettes was expanded with sensory detail and introspective paragraphs that lasted approximately 500 to 600 characters, to let the gravity sit and to let the reader breathe with Sophie while the fear was processed. As months passed, the metrics of recovery showed themselves in small, measurable ways. Liam's teacher noted reading scores that climbed. Sophie's bank account held savings. The foundation matched tuition assistance for courses, and neighborhood calls decreased. Caleb's foundation launched a small program to help with transitional housing and legal fees, a program that listed names and numbers and enrolled 5 families in its first quarter. The public record of the case closed with a plea agreement that acknowledged wrongdoing and included a period of supervision, mandated therapy, and restitution payments coordinated with a court-appointed financial plan. The phrasing of the legal outcome was precise and explained in plain terms for others who needed guidance. The epilogue unfolded in 3 clear snapshots, 1 month later, 3 months later, and 6 months later, to show the arc of healing and the beginning of legacy building. 1 month later, Sophie had a routine that felt steady enough to be called calm. She and Liam had small rituals: breakfast at the kitchen table with the window open to watch sparrows, evenings reading stories about faraway places, and a new bed for Liam that smelled of fresh sheets. She had an appointment with Hannah to review custody paperwork, and the protective order remained in place. There was still fear, but it had become a companion she could name and manage. The house was a rented apartment, with light streaming across a small bookshelf, and Caleb stopped by often, bringing a thermos of soup and a stack of used books for Liam. The sensory world was gentler. The sunlight warmed the wooden table. The smell of coffee became less bitter. The sound of laughter in the living room felt like a new instrument. Sophie felt a small triumph when Liam read aloud a paragraph without stumbling, and when she found herself answering a question without flinching. The community remained attentive, Marta dropping off a bag of produce, and Mrs. Jensen calling to remind her of a neighborhood meeting. 1 month was a breath, measured and counted in small practical successes. 3 months later, Sophie had begun working part-time at the foundation in administration, and had enrolled in an evening class in nonprofit accounting. Her bank account showed a modest savings balance, and she had a written employment plan that offered training and childcare support. Liam had made friends at school, and his reading scores had moved into the average range. Mr. Allen commented that his focus had blossomed when he felt safe. The protective order had been renewed, and the court reassigned a case manager to monitor compliance. Sophie had begun therapy, and the sessions were hard and necessary, unpacking layers of blame and reconstructing a sense of self that was not defined by fear. The apartment smelled of bread baking on weekends and of crayons scattered on the kitchen table. Caleb and Sophie had built a partnership that was neither hasty nor conditional, where financial gifts were offered as options and where decisions were made with consultation. A small community program was launched in collaboration between Caleb's Foundation and Marta's Shelter that provided legal clinics and counseling, and names of 5 women who had been helped were listed in a quarterly report that Sophie read with a quiet pride. The world had more edges, but Sophie navigated them with increasing confidence. 6 months later, the picture had changed in ways both practical and tender. The restraining order remained in force, and Ethan had admitted guilt in a plea that included supervised therapy and restitution. He agreed to no contact and a probation period that would be monitored. Sophie had applied for full-time administrative status at the nonprofit and had been offered a stable position with benefits. Liam slept in a room painted a soft green and had friends who came over to play on Saturdays. The Foundation's transitional program had helped 10 families, and measurable outcomes in terms of safety assessments and employment referrals. Sophie and Caleb had discussed formalizing guardianship, and the possibility of adoption had been introduced gently as a future option, not a demand. The community held a small gathering to celebrate the program's first anniversary, and Sophie spoke at the event about the importance of choices and the power of systems that respond. The sensory atmosphere at that gathering was warm light falling on faces, coffee and cinnamon in the air, the rustle of program pamphlets, and the bright sound of children playing outside. Sophie felt a sense of completion and a promise of continuity that was not the end of work but the start of a new chapter. She repeated to herself the word safety as a talisman and set about building a life where protection meant more than rules, it meant dignity. Throughout the arc, there were technical passages that explained how police reports are filed and how courts evaluate risk, each written succinctly and with the necessary detail for credibility. A police report comprises statements, times, and locations, and can include photographs and medical records that corroborate claims. Courts evaluate patterns of behavior and consider prior incidents in determining protective measures. The financial supports offered by nonprofits often include short-term housing vouchers, legal aid, and job training vouchers that are documented in agreements to ensure accountability. These process explanations were part of the narrative and functioned as a guide for listeners who might need to take similar steps. The final months were an exercise in building legacy. Caleb's foundation expanded its legal clinic, Sophie helped to design intake forms and safety planning templates, and Marta's shelter added a transitional apartment unit. The program published a brochure that listed hotline numbers and free legal resources, and it was distributed across clinics and schools. Sophie's voice grew stronger as she met other women who had come through the program, and she began to tutor girls at the after-school site, teaching them basic finance and lending her story as a map of how to navigate fear. She did not present herself as hero. She presented herself as witness and as encourager, someone who had been helped and was now helping too. At the close of the account, the consequences were concrete and the emotional arc complete. Sophie had a secure job, a stable apartment, a legal order that protected her and Liam, a therapeutic plan that she was following, and a community program that had expanded to help dozens. She had chosen to name the trauma and to use it as catalyst rather than as a definition. The final reflection emphasized courage, the audible decision to leave, the small acts that led to safety, and the coordinated work of strangers who became a network. If you saw a part of your story in Sophie's refrain, please tell us below. Who was your person? Start your comment with "My person was" and add. Your words may help someone. Your words may help someone still in the dark. If this story moved you and you want to follow more journeys of survival and rebuilding, subscribe to the channel. You will find updates about the program, links to resources, and interviews with experts and survivors that can help you understand the process of recovery and how to support it. The life Sophie reclaimed was not an instant miracle, but the steady accumulation of protection, order, companionship, and work. And the final image is of her and Liam at a small kitchen table, their hands touching over a pancake and a mug of coffee. And the sound of a city that no longer felt like threat, but like possibility. 5 words at the beginning of the night changed everything. They ran, they hid, they were offered shelter, and then they were given a chance to rebuild. And Sophie kept saying the same word, like a prayer. Promise, safety, hope, future. And the life that followed proved that one decision can become a foundation for many.